So in June of this year, we were given the opportunity to present our work on our Cercospora risk warning system. The opportunity to present that at the International Institute for Sugar Beet Research in Belgium. And what I'd like to do, probably the next 10-15 minutes, just take you through that presentation. I should just acknowledge that the work I was helped by Stephen Morris of AB Sugar, and a debt of gratitude for Stephen because he did a lot of the detailed data handling and data analysis. So just to set the scene, obviously before 2020, Cercospora leaf spot was really just an occasional foliar disease in the UK. And we had relatively low incidences, and those two photographs on the right there, we saw symptoms, but we never saw kind of a complete loss of foliage. And our fungicide programs we used pretty much gave us reasonable control of Cercospora. But in 2020, we saw widespread Cercospora infection, particularly in late August. And in some crops, we saw complete loss of canopy, and probably 30 to 40% of crops were assessed as having some moderate or severe infection. Clearly, we understand and on analysis that those crops which had virus yellow symptoms, and of course that was a particularly bad year for virus yellow symptoms, seemed to be more affected. So clearly the inherent susceptibility of crops were reduced by virus, which made the Cercospora fungus much easier for it to infect. And of course the photograph you can see on the left there was kind of typical of some fields where there was very high levels of infection, and eventually all those dead leaves were dropped, and then obviously crops tended to regenerate, producing regrowth, which is the picture on the right at the bottom. And of course that regrowth uses sugar from the root, and it also increases the level of impurities. So not do we only use root yield, we have low sugars and high impurity levels. So following 2020, it was absolutely key that we understood and most importantly put a risk assessment process in place. We didn't currently use anything in the UK at this stage, but we're very much aware that in previous work in countries where Cercospora is more established, particularly in Europe and North America, systems have been used. This allowed us to quickly establish a new system based on some of the work they'd done. So our key objectives were really to provide very quickly a UK risk assessment system, which then we would hopefully be able to use to target our use of fungicides. Particularly going into 21 and 22, we knew we were probably going to lose fungicides. We have resistance issues, and of course it's a cost implications as well. So we really wanted to make sure we could use fungicides most efficiently. And I think also one of our objectives was to educate growers and agronomists, because bear in mind we haven't had to deal with Cercospora epidemics historically. Just casting our mind back to 2020 again, just to give us a bit of background on that. When we looked at some of the weather stations we had in place in crops, particularly on our trial sites, we could see that the weather events in August, which were linked to the Cercospora epidemic, very clearly pointed us the way. So we had some very high temperatures, particularly nighttime temperatures, and we had some very high humidities. And on those graphs there, you can see the temperature boxes and also the blue, which is the humidity, going over that thin line, which is effectively a 85% humidity threshold. So very clearly, those kind of temperatures are linked to the outbreaks we had in 2020. So for 2021, what we decided to do was actually establish two ways of measuring weather conditions to link to Cercospora risk. The first one was a network of 40 in-crop monitoring stations, and you can see the locations there. We use the Cencrop system, which is positioned in the crop, and they had a forecasting system as well. So not only could they record current information, they looked at forecasted information over a 4 or 5 day period. But alongside that, we also wanted to kind of validate it against a wider network of stations, and we used WeatherQuest to do that, who obviously have a link of a whole range of different Met stations, and again they can also have the WeatherQuest forecasting system, so we can look forward as well. So we established those in 2021. The disease risk model is actually quite simple. And those of you who are familiar with potatoes and potato blight will be familiar with that model, which uses temperature versus humidity. And the table there very quickly shows that as the temperature increases, certainly from 16 up to 30 degrees, and then the number of hours when the humidity is above 90%, as that increases, the risk of infection increases. And that has been linked to a value they call the daily infection value. And this is where we have a great advantage of people doing this kind of validation work for us. So we can actually just utilize this and put it into practice. And of course, the little chart on the side on the right there shows that if you get to 2 days of DIV, so they're the daily infection values, below 6, the risk of Cercospora is very low. When we get to 6, we're into kind of marginal amber situation. But as soon as we're getting DIVs, 2 days of DIVs of 7 and above, we know the conditions are very favourable for Cercospora. And we're very lucky again, because a lot of that validation work has actually been done by these countries where Cercospora is more established. One of the questions we wanted to ask ourselves was actually when we're measuring humidity, and it does appear the humidity and possibly free water on the leaf is very important for Cercospora, for the fungus to sporulate and obviously develop. We've done a little bit of work to show we're measuring relative humidity probably either on the headland or the side of the crop. Clearly humidity is probably going to be lower than it is in the crop, and we're obviously able to look at some data, historical data, which reinforces that, and the difference is somewhere between 3 and 5%. So when you have a temperature measuring outside the crop, you know in the crop it's probably going to be 3 to 5% higher. Because of that, we decided to adopt an 87% threshold rather than a 90 used in the model to allow for those measurements which were being made outside the crop. One of the other questions often is asked, is leaf wetness more important? I've alluded it to already. So we actually, on our in-crop systems, we actually put sensors down in the crop. You see the photograph there on the left-hand side with a little kind of elliptical mechanical leaf, which detects water on it and records that as leaf wetness. And there is some indication again from previous work that when you certainly get above 10 hours of leaf wetness, that's obviously quite critical, and Cercospora can develop very quickly. So we were interested to look at that as well. Anyhow, we put this all together into our Cercospora early warning system, which many of you will be familiar with. We launched that in 2021, and we monitored on a daily basis, not just the in-crop monitors, but also the WeatherQuest network. We got our first ambers and red warnings in mid to late July. And actually, third week of July, we had red and amber alerts in 37 of the 40 in-crop sensors. And interestingly, we then saw our first cases of Cercospora confirmed, both at samples sent into the plant clinic, but what growers and agronomists were finding in the crop from July onwards. So that appeared to be quite accurate in terms of being able to predict when we were going to get symptoms. As you're very familiar, we were able to access information, particularly those people who had direct access to the in-crop stations on the phone app. But perhaps more importantly, we put information out regularly or in the bulletin to show where there are high risks and low risks. We tended to use a traffic light system, which I think is well understood. And obviously that when we put those high risk warnings out, just remember, this is not an indication or a recommendation to spray. It's advising that the conditions are very conducive to Cercospora symptoms to go and check. And as soon as you find the first symptoms, certainly where you're finding more than 5 lesions per plant, so very low levels, that is the time to put the fungicide on. But it's very important to understand you need to put the fungicides on when you see the first signs of disease and the disease is active. Following those first rounds of reds in July, it was quite warm and dry through to September, but then in early September we saw a further kind of round of red and amber alerts, again in 19 of the 40 in-crop sensors, and also on the WeatherQuest system. which you can see on the maps there. And the beauty of having the weather quest is obviously we had greater and wider coverage, and you can see there it was more critical in some areas, and that allowed us to actually send alerts using postcodes. So each of those 6 kilometre squares you can see on the map there, we can link to postcodes, and we were able to put that out and warn those growers in those areas. And for many, that was the trigger to put the second fungicides on. So apart from those July and those September high risk periods, we didn't get any other reds or ambers detected in 2021. What I'll do now is I'll take you through a typical field scenario. It's a Sandy Loam field in Norfolk. It's one of our BBRO demo sites there. There you can see the crop at the end of the June, nice and healthy. And obviously you can see the location of it there. And of course we had the same crop per station in this particular field. So let me just explain this graph. So the colours there are obviously what the Cercospora warning is, starting at green, amber and reds. And the graph shows the number of lesions per leaf. So this is the development of the disease, the progression curve, if you like, against time. So clearly you moving along until we got that 3rd or 4th week of July, when we started to get in reds, which was clearly an indication that conditions were conducive, and indeed Cercospora began to develop. Obviously that was time for the first fungicide to go on. Actually, in this scenario, the T2 was quite late in going on, probably about 10 to 14 days later than we perhaps would have preferred. And as you can see from the solid blue line, you can see the disease kind of progressed quite quickly, slowed a little bit, but did actually progress and continue to progress. And then, of course, we had that second high risk area in September, which really flagged up the T2 timing. And again, in this situation, in this particular crop, there was no T2 applied because it was going to be an early harvested one. The dotted line along the bottom shows what happened in adjacent crops where the T1 was used earlier and also a T2 was applied. So again, it's beginning to paint a really important picture that for Cercospora, that T1 timing is really key. And when the pressure remains high or becomes high again, putting that T2 on is just as important. You can see the difference there. And that photograph actually is taken from the field we are in, so you can see the levels of Cercospora we had by being a little bit late with the T1 timing, no T2. We enabled us to do a little bit of a survey. So we had a number of fields where we knew we could look at disease in quite a bit of detail and look at it in line with what advice had been followed and how fungicides are being applied. We used a very, very simple disease assessment key, which is shown there from slight, moderate to severe. And if you look at those charts there, it's simply showing the severity of Cercospora in crops in the different categories. So very clearly where that T1, sorry, and T2 was applied in line with the risk as indicated by the model, you can see we have much higher proportion of much lower levels of Cercospora. When the T1 was done in line but no T2, not surprisingly, we saw a bit more moderate and severe disease. Probably the worst case scenario, clearly, when that T1 was applied late and no T2, as was the case in the field I just took you through. And then the other scenarios where the T1 was in line, but the T2 was late, which kind of increased the levels of moderate and severe, but actually probably reinforcing the message that timing that T21 is probably the most critical decision to get right. So quite interesting to have a bit of a survey. I would say probably only around 20-25 crops, and hopefully we can build on that over the years to actually understand how implementation of advice affects the levels of severity in crops. Of course, we can start factoring into the whole disease risk model is the effect of varieties, and it's something they do in other countries, something we're beginning to look at. And I just thought I'd share this slide because in our variety strips, many of you have seen these in the field where we drill 4 drills of each variety across the field. You can see there, so this is our site in Bracebridge at the end of January. You can see a very large difference between 2 varieties there, and that is mainly a result of Cercospora. So you've got a very susceptible variety on the left compared to the one on the right. And we probably do need to start factoring this in, but we need to gather a little bit more comprehensive information on those varieties because it may influence how we decide to manage the result. Just some comparisons we made. If you remember, we ran the in-crop sensors versus the WeatherQuest network, and this shows here that the in-crop sensor was more sensitive to the weather data and created more red and ambers, particularly ambers, than the network. We need to understand how important are ambers. So if you remember those situations when we get a DIV of 6, which are marginal, but there was more of those generated by the in-crop than they were by the network. So it's useful to have that information. We need to understand the implications of that. So that's one of those areas of development we need to do. And if you remember, I talked about leaf wetness earlier versus relative humidity. Again, and their little graph at the bottom there shows the printout of the leaf sensors. They're the green bars. You can see that dark green for a slightly higher level of leaf wetness compared to the paler ones, and you can see how they were generated through the season and also linked to temperature and humidity. And if we look at those, clearly the leaf wetness in that little table there generated more red DIVs than just the RH sensor. So on that basis, it does say that if we're using leaf wetness, that it could be that that's more critical to disease development rather than just relative humidity. It's something which is being looked at, as I said, by other research teams around Europe, and there is a general feeling that perhaps leaf wetness, so actually having free water on the leaf, which will encourage the disease to sporulate, may be more critical to the disease development. And again, something we have to be mindful of and understand how we deal with that in trying to improve the accuracy of it. So just a final slide. If you remember, I outlined those initial objectives. Did we meet them? I think yes. In terms of a relatively effective early warning model, I think we could tick that box. And I think the feedback from growers was very positive. And I think many of them did use that information and found that information very useful in guiding their fungicide programs. I think what it did highlight to us that because we need to identify Cercospora at a very early stage, I think some more training on monitoring and early symptom recognition is required. Because if you remember, those small survey clearly showed that timing of the T1, that first fungicide application going on at early symptom identification is absolutely key. One of the areas I feel we still need to deal with is actually sources of Cercospora on farm. One thing we were looking at last year is the growth of beet on spoil heats and where dumps were, and we found all too easily we're able to find plants which not just had virus but also had some Cercospora. So we really need to focus on managing and removing the sources of Cercospora on farm as well. And the other ones are probably some development areas which probably aren't super critical to the model, but probably ways we can make it a bit more accurate in the future, understanding how we can use leaf wetness and also integrating varietal susceptibility and of course harvest data into the model. So I hope that's been useful. I hope that's given you a little bit of an overview of the systems developments, how we've developed them, and how they've worked. Of course, if you have any questions on this, you know where we are. So please do give us a call. And as we stand in July 2022, it's very interesting because we've got our systems running again this year. We haven't seen any Cercospora developing crops, and we haven't had any triggering of high risk periods as well. And actually, when you strip back the data, despite some very, very warm temperatures in crops this year, the humidity, the leaf wetness, the free water on the leaves has been very, very low. So again, that's supporting that these models are quite accurate in terms of understanding what conditions are needed to trigger Cercospora. That can all change if we get some rain, of course, so something we are watching very carefully over the next few days. But I think it helps build the confidence that those disease prediction models are working well.